I'm Rebecca Morgan. I'm 41 years old, and I built my career from a mechanic's daughter to a brigadier general in the United States Air Force. For 12 years, I poured time, money, and loyalty into holding my family together, especially after my father remarried a woman named Catherine Hayes. But the night my stepmother grabbed the Medal of Honor pin off my dress uniform at a military charity gala and accused me of stealing it because I was too poor to be wearing something like that, everything I'd been silent about for over a decade finally broke open. Have you ever been dismissed or humiliated by someone you sacrificed everything for? If you have, drop your story in the comments. Trust me, you're in good company. Before I tell you what happened that night and what came after, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being disrespected by family, hit like and subscribe. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to every woman who's been told she's not enough while carrying everyone else's weight. What came after that gala might surprise you. I grew up in a small house next to Randolph Air Force Base in Texas. The smell of aircraft oil and instant coffee defined my childhood. My mother died when I was 8, stage 4 breast cancer that took her in 6 brutal months. The last thing she gave me wasn't jewelry or money. It was a small bronze pin shaped like a 5-pointed star, the emblem of the Medal of Honor. My great-uncle, First Lieutenant James Sullivan, had sacrificed his life at Normandy in 1944 to save his entire squad when their position was overrun. He died 3 days later from the wounds he sustained doing it. My mother wore that pin her whole life to remember the father she never got to meet. She passed it to me with one message: "Sweetheart, honor isn't something people give you. It's something you earn every day by living true to your conscience." After Mom died, my father, Thomas Morgan, became everything to me. He was a senior aircraft mechanic, hands permanently stained with grease, shoulders perpetually hunched from decades bent over turbines. We didn't talk much about feelings. We talked about fixing things, about showing up, about doing what needed to be done. That became our language. When I joined the Air Force at 18, Dad drove me to the recruiter's office in his work truck, still wearing his coveralls. He shook my hand when I signed the papers. No tears, no speeches. Just a firm grip and a nod that said everything he couldn't put into words. He was there when I graduated basic training at Lackland, standing in the bleachers in a shirt he'd ironed himself. He was there when I commissioned as a second lieutenant through officer training school at 23, when I pinned on captain at 27. Every milestone, every duty station transfer, he found a way to be present. I made captain at 27 in the middle of what felt like the busiest years of my life. I was managing logistics teams, deploying frequently to combat zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Air Force became my identity in ways I hadn't anticipated. It gave me structure, purpose, a clear path forward. Dad understood that. He'd spent his whole life in service to machines that kept people safe in the air. We both believed in the work, even when it cost us sleep, certainty, and the kind of stable home life most people build. That's when he met Catherine. I was deployed to Afghanistan when he first mentioned her. A casual comment in an email. Started seeing someone, thought you should know. No details, no fanfare. When I came home 4 months later in early 2010, she was already woven into his daily routine. Catherine Hayes was 52 then, 15 years younger than Dad, with carefully styled auburn hair and a wardrobe that seemed too expensive for someone dating a retired mechanic on a fixed income. But she was warm to me at first, almost effusive. She asked about my deployments, about the aircraft logistics I coordinated, about what it was like being a woman in a male-dominated field. "Your father talks about you constantly," she said over dinner that first night, her hand resting on Dad's arm with practiced intimacy. "I'm so proud to know you." It felt genuine. I wanted it to be genuine. Dad deserved companionship. He'd spent 15 years alone after Mom's death, never complaining, never asking for more than he had. If Catherine made him happy, that was enough for me. I told myself I'd be supportive, that I wouldn't be the difficult daughter who resented her father moving on. So when Catherine started joining us for holidays, when she moved into the house a year later, I welcomed it. I helped them repaint the living room during a weekend of leave. I brought gifts when I visited. I tried. Looking back now, I see the signs I missed. Catherine never mentioned her past. No stories about previous relationships. No details about where she'd worked or what she'd done before meeting Dad. When asked, she'd smile and redirect the conversation back to us, to Dad's work, to my military career. At the time, I thought she was just private, maybe shy about sharing her history with someone new. Her clothes were another thing I noticed, but didn't question deeply enough. Designer labels, expensive jewelry, shoes that cost more than Dad's monthly pension. She explained it away vaguely: smart shopping, gifts from friends, items she'd had for years. I accepted these explanations because challenging them felt rude, felt like I was looking for problems where none existed. But the biggest sign I missed was how quickly she made herself indispensable. Within 6 months, she'd reorganized Dad's finances, taken over his social calendar, positioned herself as the gatekeeper to his life. If I wanted to visit, I called Catherine first. If I needed to talk to Dad, I checked with Catherine about his availability. She never said no directly, but she had ways of making things difficult, scheduling conflicts, last-minute changes, subtle implications that my timing was inconvenient. I told myself she was just being helpful, taking care of Dad, making his life easier. The first time I gave them money was when Dad had complications from a hernia surgery in late 2010. The insurance covered most of it, but not all. Co-pays, follow-up visits, medications. They added up faster than his retirement income could handle. I didn't think twice. I wired $3,000 and told him not to worry about paying it back. Catherine called me that evening, her voice thick with gratitude that sounded almost rehearsed in hindsight. "You're an angel, Rebecca. I don't know what we'd do without you. Thomas is so lucky to have a daughter like you." A few months later, the water heater broke. Then the roof needed repairs after a bad storm. Then Dad's truck threw a transmission. Each time I helped. Each time Catherine's gratitude was effusive and immediate. Each time I felt like I was doing what family does: showing up, fixing things, not keeping score. But Catherine was keeping score. Not of the money itself, but of my willingness to provide it. She was learning my patterns, testing my boundaries, figuring out exactly how far she could push before I'd say no. And I never said no. Because these were emergencies. Because Dad needed help. Because saying no to family felt wrong. Catherine started introducing me to her friends at gatherings. Women I didn't know, mostly wives of local business owners and professionals. "This is my stepdaughter," she'd say, gesturing toward me with that practiced smile. "She works in the military." Never my rank, never specifics, just vague enough to sound impressive without being too detailed. Her friends would nod politely and ask surface-level questions. I'd answer briefly before the conversation moved on to other things: Catherine's recent home improvement project, someone's upcoming vacation, gossip about people I'd never met. I started noticing that Catherine always positioned herself at the center of these gatherings. She was the one who knew everyone's business, who connected people, who made things happen. And increasingly, she used my military career as social currency, mentioning it casually to elevate her own status, to show that she was connected to someone important, someone accomplished. But she never actually wanted to know about the work itself: the late nights coordinating supply chains across hostile territory, the impossible decisions about resource allocation when there's never enough to go around, the weight of responsibility when people's safety depends on your competence. She wanted the status without the substance. I made major at 34 in 2011, after a particularly demanding assignment managing logistics for a joint operations task force during a humanitarian crisis in Pakistan. The promotion came with more responsibility, longer hours, and recognition that Dad framed and hung in his workshop next to photos of Mom and his own military commendations from Vietnam. Catherine threw a small party. She invited her social circle, women I barely knew, mostly the same wives I'd met before. She spent most of the evening talking about how she'd always known I'd go far, how she'd pushed me when I needed that encouragement. "I told Thomas from the beginning that girl has something special," she said to a group clustered near the kitchen. "She just needed someone to believe in her." Dad glanced at me across the room. I could see the question in his eyes. Should he correct her? Should he point out that Catherine had only been in our lives for a year? That my promotion was based on work I'd been doing long before she arrived? I shook my head slightly. It wasn't worth it. Let her have the story. Let her feel important. But something shifted in me that night. A small recognition that Catherine's version of events and reality were beginning to diverge in ways that made me uncomfortable. She hadn't pushed me toward anything. She hadn't been there for the deployments, the late nights, the years of proving myself in rooms where I was often the only woman. But in her telling, she was central to my success, a guiding force rather than a recent addition. Over the next few years, I settled into an uneasy rhythm. I'd visit every few months when my schedule allowed, help out where I could financially, and keep my interactions with Catherine polite and functional. She'd grown more comfortable in her role as Dad's partner, more confident in her position within his life. But there was also a shift I couldn't quite name, a subtle hardening of her tone when she spoke to me, an edge that cut deeper than her earlier warmth. She started commenting on my schedule with increasing frequency. "You work too much, Rebecca. Don't pilots burn out?" I wasn't a pilot. I told her multiple times I was a logistics officer, but she either couldn't remember or didn't care to. In her mind, all military officers were the same, interchangeable parts in a machine she didn't understand or want to understand. "You should be helping your father more," she'd say when I couldn't rearrange leave to assist with something minor. A doctor's appointment he could easily handle himself, a home repair that could wait, errands that Catherine herself was perfectly capable of managing. The implication was clear. I was failing. As a daughter, as a family member, as a person. My career was selfish. My choices were wrong. My priorities needed adjustment. And when I did help, when I sent money or rearranged my schedule or showed up when I was exhausted, Catherine began rewriting those contributions in real time. She'd tell people she handled everything herself, that I was too busy to really be there, that Dad's recovery or success was due to her care and attention. I'd contributed thousands of dollars, hours of my time, emotional energy I could barely spare. But in Catherine's narrative, I was mostly absent, a daughter who'd let her career consume her, who'd abandoned her father in his retirement years. I told myself it was insecurity, that Catherine was still adjusting to being part of our family, still figuring out how to share space with a daughter who'd been there first. I told myself to be patient, to give her time, to not take it personally. But it was personal. Every rewritten history, every minimized contribution, every subtle dig at my choices. It was all personal. Catherine was systematically erasing me from the family story, while simultaneously using my achievements to elevate herself. When I made Lieutenant Colonel at 38 in 2014, after a high-profile assignment coordinating multinational air defense exercises across Europe, Catherine called her relatives before I'd even told my closest friends. She framed the achievement as a family victory, told everyone she'd always believed in me, always pushed me toward success. I knew from the moment I met her. I overheard her telling someone on the phone, "I told Thomas, this girl is going places. She just needed the right support system." Dad was in the room when she said it. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he walked outside without a word. I followed him a few minutes later. He was standing in the driveway, staring at nothing. "She does that a lot now." "I know." "Takes credit for things she had nothing to do with." "I know. I should say something." Maybe. But we both knew he wouldn't. Because saying something meant confrontation, meant choosing sides, meant risking the peace he'd worked so hard to build in his retirement years. So we stood there in silence, two people who loved each other, but couldn't quite figure out how to protect each other from someone who'd inserted herself between us. By then, Catherine had developed a robust social network, mostly spouses of local business owners and professionals. Their approval mattered to her in ways I still didn't fully understand. She wanted to appear successful, affluent, connected. She talked about home renovations and weekend trips with a casualness that didn't match Dad's fixed income. When people asked how they managed such an active lifestyle, she'd smile mysteriously and say something vague about family support, which meant me, which meant the thousands of dollars I'd sent over the years, the financial cushion I'd provided without ever expecting acknowledgement or repayment. But Catherine had begun to see those contributions as her due, not as generous help from a daughter who cared about her father, but as payments she'd earned through the simple act of being married to him. The financial requests continued, growing larger and more frequent. Air conditioning system failure, $4,500. Emergency dental work for Dad, $2,800. An investment opportunity in a friend's boutique that Catherine insisted was brilliant, $6,000. Second roof repair after another supposedly damaging storm, $5,200. I didn't keep detailed records. This was family. You don't track every dollar when it's people you love, when it's your father's comfort and security at stake. But I started noticing that many of these emergencies benefited Catherine more than Dad. The boutique investment, the upgraded air conditioning system when the old one probably had a few more years, the roof repairs that seemed excessive for minor storm damage. Catherine was using my money to fund the lifestyle she wanted, the image she was projecting to her social circle. And because the requests always came through Dad, because they were always framed as his needs, I couldn't refuse without seeming like a cruel daughter who didn't care about her aging father. She'd created the perfect trap. She began making pointed comments about how I dressed off duty, how the ribbons and decorations on my uniform made me look like I was showing off. "People don't need to see all that," she said once during a visit, gesturing at my chest full of awards. "It's a bit much, don't you think? A little arrogant." I wasn't being arrogant. I was wearing the regulation uniform with the decorations I'd earned through years of service, multiple deployments, and consistently excellent performance. But Catherine saw it as showing off, as making her feel small by comparison. I started wearing civilian clothes more often when I visited, even though I was proud of my service, proud of what those ribbons represented. But it was easier than dealing with her subtle disapproval, her cutting comments disguised as helpful suggestions. Then came the incident with my mother's pin. I wore it to a family gathering in spring 2015, pinned near my shoulder on a simple blazer. It was a delicate piece, understated, meaningful only to those who understood its significance. To most people, it looked like a small, old-fashioned brooch, nothing special. Catherine pulled me aside in the kitchen, away from the others. Her voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "People are going to think that's fake, Rebecca." I stared at her, not understanding at first what she meant. "You should probably leave it at home," she continued, not meeting my eyes. "It looks expensive. People might get the wrong idea about where you got it." It was my mother's. "I know. I'm just saying, it looks like something you couldn't afford on a military salary. It might make people uncomfortable. They might think you're trying to seem more important than you are." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. She was suggesting I'd bought a fake piece of expensive jewelry to impress people, that I was pretending to be wealthier or more sophisticated than I actually was. She was saying I was a fraud. Dad overheard from the doorway. I saw his jaw tighten, saw his hands clench at his sides. He looked at me, then at Catherine, then walked outside without a word. I should have said something then. Should have drawn a clear, unmovable line. Should have made Catherine understand that she didn't get to dictate what I wore, especially something as meaningful as the pin my mother had given me before she died. But I didn't want to create conflict. Didn't want to force Dad to choose between his daughter and his wife. Didn't want to be the difficult one, the one who couldn't just let things go. So I let it pass, filed it away with all the other small humiliations and quiet disrespects that had been accumulating over the years like sediment at the bottom of a river. I didn't see the pattern yet. Or maybe I saw it, but wasn't ready to acknowledge what it meant. That Catherine was no longer interested in being part of the family. She was interested in controlling its image, in taking credit for its successes, in maintaining the appearance of stability and affluence, without actually contributing the work or resources to earn it. The signs became impossible to ignore as Dad's health stabilized and Catherine's behavior intensified. The warmth she'd shown early on had evaporated completely, replaced by something colder, more calculating, more openly hostile when no one else was watching. She stopped asking about my work unless other people were around to hear it. She stopped thanking me for financial help unless it was performative, staged for an audience who could witness her gratitude. I made full colonel at 40 in 2015 after leading a complex airlift operation during an earthquake relief effort that required 72 hours of continuous coordination across 4 time zones. The promotion was significant. Recognition of years of consistent performance and leadership under extreme pressure. It was the achievement I'd been working toward my entire career, the rank that opened doors to strategic leadership positions. Dad was proud. He called me the night the announcement came through, his voice thick with emotion he didn't quite know how to express. "Your mother would have been so proud too." I knew. I felt her absence in that moment more acutely than I had in years. She would have understood what this meant, what it had cost, what it represented. Catherine's reaction was entirely different. She posted about it on social media before I'd even told most of my friends, tagging me in a long, effusive paragraph about our family's success and how she'd always known Rebecca would achieve great things. The comments poured in, congratulatory messages from people I'd never met, all directed at Catherine as much as at me. She responded to each one, soaking up the attention, basking in reflected glory that wasn't hers to claim. When I visited the following month, I found she'd printed the post and framed it. It hung in the hallway next to photos of Dad's military service from Vietnam and my academy graduation. Except the focus wasn't the achievement itself. It was Catherine's narration of it, her public claim to a success she had absolutely nothing to do with. Her comments about my career grew sharper after that. She'd ask why I wasn't married, why I'd chosen work over family, why I didn't visit more often given how much Dad was aging. Each question carried an implied criticism. My priorities were wrong. I was failing at the parts of life that truly mattered. I was a disappointing daughter despite my professional success. "You're so focused on rank and recognition," she said once during a particularly tense visit. "But what are you building outside of that? What will you have when you retire? Who will care for you when you're old?" I didn't answer. The truth was complex. I was building competence, trust, leadership capability. I was responsible for hundreds of personnel, millions of dollars in equipment, missions that required precision and judgment under impossible conditions. I was contributing to something larger than myself, serving a purpose that gave my life meaning. But explaining that to Catherine felt pointless. She'd already decided what my life meant, what my choices represented. In her view, I was a cold, career-obsessed woman who'd sacrificed real human connection for empty professional achievements. Nothing I said would change that narrative. She started correcting me in front of others, small things that individually seemed too petty to challenge, but accumulated into a pattern of disrespect. How I loaded the dishwasher, how I parked in the driveway, how I folded towels, how I made coffee. Each correction delivered with a smile, with a veneer of helpfulness. "Oh, honey, we don't do it that way." "Here, let me show you." But the message underneath was clear. "You don't belong here the way I do. This is my house now. These are my rules." Dad noticed. I could see it in the way he'd changed the subject when Catherine started in on me, the way he'd offer to help with something just to get me out of the room, away from her constant low-grade criticism. But he never said anything directly. He was trying to keep peace in his own home, caught between the daughter he'd raised alone for 15 years and the woman he'd chosen to share his retirement with. I understood his position, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. I started visiting less frequently. Not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just gradually spacing out trips, finding reasons to stay on base during long weekends, volunteering for additional duties that kept me occupied and away from that house where I no longer felt welcome. It was easier than sitting there absorbing small humiliations while pretending everything was fine. Catherine's social circle became her primary focus and source of validation. She hosted dinners, organized charity events, positioned herself as a central figure in a group of people who valued appearances above substance. She thrived in that environment, where surface-level charm and careful presentation mattered more than actual accomplishments or genuine relationships. Her friends admired her home, her style, her seemingly perfect life with a retired military mechanic and his accomplished daughter. They didn't see the tension underneath, the way she controlled every detail, the way she rewrote reality to suit whatever narrative made her look best. She started implying to people that I was difficult. Not directly, never overtly, but in the way she'd sigh heavily when my name came up, the way she'd mention how busy I always was, how I never had time for family anymore. She painted herself as the patient, understanding stepmother dealing with a daughter who'd grown distant and cold, who'd let military life harden her into someone unrecognizable. I heard about it through a cousin who'd attended one of Catherine's gatherings. She mentioned it casually, not realizing how it would land. "Catherine was saying you don't visit much anymore. She seems really worried about you, like she thinks the military is changing you in bad ways." Worried, as if my absence was the problem, not the environment that made visiting unbearable. as if I was the one who'd changed, not Catherine who'd revealed her true nature after establishing herself securely in Dad's life. The breaking point started building the day she criticized my uniform directly. I'd stopped by during a brief leave in October 2016, still in service dress because I'd come directly from a meeting at Regional Command. The ribbons and decorations I wore represented years of service, deployments to active combat zones, achievements and responsibilities that most people couldn't begin to understand. Catherine looked at them and frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line of disapproval. "It's too much. You look like you're trying to show off, like you need everyone to know how important you are." "This is the regulation uniform. These are the decorations I've earned." "I know, but still, it's a lot. People might think you're being arrogant, like you're rubbing your success in everyone's face." Dad set his coffee down too hard. The sound echoed in the kitchen like a gunshot. "Catherine." She turned to him, expression innocent, carefully crafted to look confused by his reaction. "What?" "I'm just trying to help. I'm just saying what other people are probably thinking." I left the room before I said something I'd regret. Before I finally spoke the truth that had been building for years. The comments about my mother's pin came up again a few weeks later during another gathering. Catherine mentioned it to one of her friends while I was standing right there, saying she'd tried to gently suggest that I not wear it because it gives the wrong impression, makes people think she's trying to seem wealthier than she actually is. The friend glanced at me uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond to such a blatant insult delivered with a smile. "It was my mother's," I said evenly, keeping my voice calm even as rage built in my chest. "It's a family heirloom." Catherine smiled, the expression not reaching her eyes. "I know, sweetheart. I'm just thinking of how it looks to other people. I'm trying to protect you from embarrassment." The condescension in sweetheart hung in the air, the implication that I needed protecting, that I didn't understand how the world worked, that I was naive about my own appearance and reputation. I realized then, with sudden brutal clarity, that Catherine had been building a case against me for years. Each small comment, each implied criticism, each rewritten history was part of a larger narrative she was constructing. The difficult stepdaughter, who didn't appreciate what she had, who was too career-focused to be a real part of the family, who needed Catherine's guidance and correction and patient tolerance. And I'd let her build that narrative. I'd stayed quiet to keep the peace. I'd absorbed the disrespect because I didn't want to burden Dad with conflict. I told myself it wasn't that bad, that I was overreacting, that she didn't really mean it the way it sounded. But she did mean it exactly the way it sounded, and it was that bad. And I wasn't overreacting. Catherine was systematically undermining me while using my achievements for her own social benefit. She was taking credit for my success while criticizing my choices. She was spending my money while telling people I was absent. She was rewriting my history while erasing my contributions, and I had been letting her do it because I was afraid of conflict, afraid of forcing Dad to choose, afraid of being seen as the difficult one who couldn't just get along with her father's new wife. I started keeping emotional distance after that. I'd be polite, functional, present when absolutely required, but I stopped offering more than the minimum. I stopped helping financially, unless Dad asked directly, and I could verify the need was real. I stopped rearranging my schedule to accommodate last-minute requests. I stopped pretending Catherine's behavior didn't bother me, stopped smiling through her insults, stopped accepting her version of reality. She noticed immediately, and she didn't like it at all. The military charity Gala was held at the Fairmont Hotel downtown in November 2016, a formal black tie event supporting veteran transition programs and military family services. I'd been invited as a guest of honor, one of several senior officers recognized for contributions to veteran welfare and military community support. Dad was genuinely excited to attend. Catherine insisted on coming, talked for weeks about what she'd wear, about who might be there, about the prestige of being associated with such an important military event. I wore a simple black dress, fitted but not flashy, appropriate for the formal setting. At my shoulder, I pinned my mother's brooch, the bronze piece I'd worn for years, a small link to the woman I barely remembered, but whose strength I tried to carry forward every day. We arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. The ballroom was already filling with a mix of active duty personnel in dress uniforms, veterans from multiple service eras, and civilians connected to various military support organizations. I recognized several faces, exchanged greetings with colleagues, introduced Dad to people who'd heard me mention him over the years. He was proud, visibly uncomfortable in the formal suit Catherine had insisted he buy, but standing straight, shaking hands with genuine warmth and humility. Catherine stayed close to us, observing everything, cataloging everyone, positioning herself to be included in photos and conversations. She introduced herself as my stepmother to anyone who'd listen, laughed too loudly at jokes she didn't quite understand, touched Dad's arm possessively whenever someone paid too much attention to him, or asked about his own military service during Vietnam. I was talking with Navy Commander Jessica Mitchell about joint service logistics coordination when Catherine approached. She waited until Commander Mitchell stepped away to greet someone else, then moved close, her voice low and sharp with an edge I'd never heard in public before. "Where did you get that?" I looked at her, genuinely confused by the hostility in her tone. "What?" She gestured toward the pin at my shoulder, her eyes locked on it with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "That. Don't tell me you actually bought something like that on your salary." The accusation landed like a physical blow. I felt the heat rise in my face, the instinctive need to defend myself against an attack I hadn't seen coming. "It was my mother's." "That's not what it looks like." Her eyes stayed fixed on the pin, her expression shifting to something harder, colder, more openly hostile than I'd ever seen her display in public. "You stole this." The words came out quietly enough that no one nearby could hear them clearly, but the venom was unmistakable. Around us, the gala continued, voices and laughter blending into background noise that suddenly seemed very far away. Catherine's hand moved toward the pin, her fingers closing around it with shocking aggression. "You're too poor to be wearing something like this. You're a fake and a thief." She pulled hard. The pin dug into the fabric of my dress, the sudden pressure wrenching my shoulder forward. I tried to step back, to create space, to escape her grip, but she held on tighter. She was actually trying to rip it off me in the middle of a ballroom full of military personnel and veterans, in front of colleagues and strangers, in front of my father. A hand closed around her wrist, firm and unyielding. Catherine gasped, her grip releasing as someone gently but decisively pulled her hand away from my dress. I looked up and saw an older man, probably mid-70s, leaning on a cane with one hand while holding Catherine's wrist with the other. He wore a simple dark suit with a few service ribbons pinned to his lapel, the posture of someone who'd spent decades in uniform and never fully left it behind even in civilian life. He looked at Catherine, his expression calm but absolutely unyielding, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't need to raise its voice. "Ma'am, that is the Medal of Honor." The room didn't exactly go silent, but I felt the shift like a physical thing. People nearby turned, paying attention now, picking up on the tension, recognizing that something significant was happening. Catherine's face went pale, then flushed deep red. She tried to pull her hand back, but the man held firm for another long second before releasing her, making his point clear. "Do you not know who she is?" he added, his voice still calm, still quiet, but carrying a weight that silenced the space around us completely. Catherine stepped back, her expression cycling rapidly through shock, confusion, and something close to panic. She looked at me, at the pin, at the people watching, trying desperately to piece together what had just happened, how she'd miscalculated so badly. Dad appeared at my side, his face flushed with shame. Not shame for me, shame for her, for what she'd just done, for the scene she'd created. The older man nodded once, a small acknowledgement directed at me, then stepped back into the crowd without waiting for thanks or recognition. Catherine opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't, I don't, I said quietly, the single word carrying all the exhaustion and hurt and anger of the past 6 years. She looked at Dad desperately, searching for support, for someone to tell her it was okay, that she'd just made an honest mistake that anyone could have made. But Dad didn't move. He stood next to me, solid and silent, and I felt the years of quiet loyalty finally reasserting themselves in the way they should have all along. Catherine turned and walked away quickly, moving through the crowd toward the exit with her head down. A few people watched her go with curious or disapproving expressions. Most returned to their conversations, the moment passing as quickly as it had erupted. already becoming just another strange incident at a crowded event. But it wasn't the public spectacle that hurt most. It wasn't the scene, the attention, the embarrassment of having people witness such a personal attack. It was the instinct behind it, the immediate assumption that anything beautiful or valuable on me couldn't possibly belong to me, that I must have stolen it. Because in Catherine's mind, I was always somehow less, always too poor, too undeserving, too much of a pretender to legitimately wear something of worth. I stood there with the pin still attached to my dress, slightly askew now from her pulling. My shoulder ached, my chest felt tight, my hands were shaking. Dad touched my arm gently. "I'm sorry." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. I stepped outside 20 minutes later, needing air, needing distance from the noise and the lights and the careful smiles of people who'd witnessed what happened but weren't sure what to say. The November night was cool and crisp, the parking lot mostly empty except for a few scattered vehicles, and the distant sound of traffic on the main road cutting through downtown. I leaned against the brick wall near the entrance, focused on breathing steadily, on containing the anger that had been building for 6 years, and had finally erupted into something I could no longer ignore or minimize. The door opened behind me. I turned expecting Dad, but it was the older man from inside. He moved carefully, his cane tapping against the pavement with measured rhythm, his expression apologetic despite having done nothing wrong. "I hope I didn't overstep back there. I don't make a habit of grabbing people." "You didn't overstep. Thank you for intervening." He nodded, seemed satisfied with my response, and turned to leave. Then he paused, looking back at me with an expression that was hard to read in the dim parking lot lighting. "For what it's worth, that pin, your great-uncle earned it. Normandy, 1944, saved his entire squad when their position got overrun, died 3 days later from wounds he took doing it." I stared at him, trying to understand how he could possibly know this. "How did you know about him?" "I didn't serve with him personally, but I knew men who did, served with some of them in Korea years later. That insignia is distinctive if you know what you're looking for, if you understand what it represents." He glanced back toward the door, toward the warmth and light and continued celebration inside. "Some people see a piece of metal and think it's jewelry, something decorative. Others see what it actually cost, the sacrifice it represents." He left before I could ask his name or thank him properly. I stood there alone for several more minutes, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how the evening had gone so completely wrong. The cool air helped clear my head, helped me think past the immediate shock and humiliation. Dad came out eventually. He looked older suddenly, more tired than I'd seen him in years. His shoulders slumped in a way that reminded me of how he'd looked in the months after Mom died. He didn't apologize again. He just stood next to me, hands deep in his pockets, staring at the parking lot like he might find answers in the pattern of painted lines and empty spaces. "She crossed a line tonight?" "Yeah, I should have said something earlier. All those little comments over the years, the way she talked to you, the way she acted like she owned your achievements. I thought if I ignored it, if I didn't make it into a big thing, it would eventually stop." "It's not your fault, Dad." "It is, though, part of it at least." He looked at me directly for the first time since coming outside. "She made you feel small in my house. She disrespected you in ways I should have recognized and stopped. And I let her do it because I wanted peace, because I was tired of being alone, because I told myself it wasn't as bad as it probably was." I didn't argue with him. He wasn't entirely wrong, even if the situation was more complicated than simple blame could capture. We stood in silence for a while longer, the kind of comfortable silence we'd always shared, the kind that didn't need filling with words just for the sake of noise. Inside, I could hear music starting, the gala shifting from its formal recognition phase into the social evening portion. I didn't want to go back in, didn't want to smile and pretend, to navigate conversations with people who'd seen me publicly humiliated and weren't sure how to acknowledge it without making things more awkward. "I'm going to head out." Dad nodded immediately. "I'll deal with Catherine." "You don't have to." "I do." His voice was firm, carrying that tone he'd used when I was young and needed to understand something wasn't negotiable. "This isn't on you to fix or manage. This is between me and her." I drove back to the base alone, the pin still attached to my dress, slightly crooked from where Catherine had grabbed it. I didn't cry during the drive, didn't feel particularly sad. I felt something closer to clarity, The kind that comes when a situation you've been avoiding or minimizing finally forces itself into sharp focus. Over the next few days, I found myself reviewing everything with new eyes. Not obsessively, not with the intention of building some kind of case against Catherine, but methodically, trying to understand how I'd gotten to this point. I thought about the money I'd given them over 6 years. I pulled up bank records, went through old emails, tried to calculate the total. Medical bills that insurance should have covered more completely. Home repairs that seemed excessive in hindsight. Investment opportunities that never materialized into anything. Emergency after emergency that always seemed to occur when my account balance was healthy. The total came to somewhere north of $40,000. Maybe more if I counted the smaller amounts I hadn't tracked carefully. $40,000 over 6 years. And Catherine had repaid me with contempt disguised as concern, with public humiliation disguised as helpful correction. I thought about the leave I'd rearranged to accommodate their needs, often their wants disguised as needs, the plans I'd canceled, the times I'd prioritized their requests over my own rest after grueling deployments, the way I'd bent myself into uncomfortable shapes trying to be the daughter Catherine seemed to want me to be, only to discover that no version of me would ever be acceptable to her. I thought about Catherine's pattern of behavior, the small cruelties that seemed harmless individually, but accumulated into something toxic. The way she'd systematically rewritten histories, taking credit for support she hadn't provided, positioning herself as central to achievements she had nothing to do with. The way she'd used my success as social currency while simultaneously resenting me for having that success, as if my accomplishments somehow diminished her or exposed her own lack of achievement. I realized I'd been compensating for her deficiencies for years, contributing more to make up for her lack of contribution, absorbing her disrespect to avoid conflict that would upset Dad, treating her bad behavior as something I needed to tolerate, rather than something I had every right to reject. But staying quiet hadn't protected Dad. It had hurt him by allowing Catherine to believe she could treat his daughter however she wanted without consequences. It had taught her that my boundaries were negotiable, that my dignity was expendable in service of maintaining false peace. A few days after the gala, one of my colleagues, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, stopped by my office. We'd worked together on several complex joint operations, developed a friendship built on mutual respect and the kind of honesty that's rare in professional military settings, where everyone's always performing, always aware of how they're being evaluated. I heard about what happened at the gala. I didn't ask how she'd heard. Word travels fast in military circles, especially when something unusual or dramatic happens at a public event. "I'm fine, Sarah." "I know you are. You're always fine. That's kind of your thing." She sat down across from my desk without being invited, which was one of the things I appreciated about our friendship. She didn't wait for permission to be direct. "But I wanted to tell you something my grandmother used to say, something that stuck with me over the years." I waited, curious where this was going. "She said people reveal who they really are by how they treat what they think you can't live without." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her expression intent. "Your stepmother thought you couldn't live without your father's approval, without maintaining that family connection. So she felt completely safe disrespecting you, undermining you, using you, because she assumed you'd tolerate anything to keep that relationship intact. She saw your loyalty as weakness she could exploit." The words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. "But here's the thing she got wrong, Rebecca. You can live without his approval. You've been doing it your entire career, making decisions he might not have chosen, taking risks he might not have understood, building a life that's entirely your own. What you actually can't live without, what none of us can live without, is our self-respect." After Sarah left, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about what she'd said, about Catherine's miscalculation, about boundaries and respect, and the difference between loyalty and self-betrayal. Catherine had believed I wouldn't challenge her because doing so might cost me my relationship with Dad. She'd believed rank and professional accomplishment meant nothing outside the military hierarchy, that my training and competence somehow made me less rather than more capable of recognizing manipulation. She'd mistaken my patience for weakness, my restraint for fear, my professionalism for passivity. She'd been wrong about all of it. I thought about the pin, about my mother, who I barely remembered but who had given me this connection to family history. About my great-uncle James Sullivan, who died at 24, younger than I'd been when I made captain, who'd never had the chance to build a life or see his sacrifice honored. I thought about what service actually means, not blind obedience or endless tolerance of mistreatment, but the strength to stand firm for what matters, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs you something. And I understood that sometimes protecting yourself is the most important mission you'll undertake. I called Dad 2 days after our parking lot conversation and asked if we could meet. Not at the house where Catherine might show up, or where her presence would color everything. Somewhere neutral. He suggested a diner we used to frequent when I was younger. One of those timeless places with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since morning, but somehow felt comforting anyway. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in our usual corner booth, hands wrapped around a white ceramic mug. He looked up when I walked in, and I saw the weariness in his face, the knowledge that this conversation would be difficult but necessary. I slid into the seat across from him. A waitress appeared immediately with coffee for me, poured without asking. Some patterns are so established they become automatic. We waited until she left before either of us spoke. Catherine's been staying at her friend Linda's house since the gala. I didn't ask her to leave, but I told her she needed space to think about what she did. I know, you told me that already. She's been calling constantly, texting, trying to explain herself, offering every excuse except an actual apology for what happened. He stared down into his coffee like it might contain answers. Everything from stress to bad lighting to your dress being misleading about what the pin was. Every explanation except taking responsibility. I wasn't surprised. Catherine's entire pattern had been about avoiding accountability while maintaining her image. I need to tell you something, Dad, and I need you to hear it without defending her, without trying to find middle ground or make excuses. He nodded, his jaw set in a way that told me he was prepared for this, had maybe been preparing for it since the gala. Catherine doesn't respect me. She hasn't for years, maybe never did. The gala wasn't an aberration or a one-time mistake. It was the natural culmination of every small dismissal, every casual cruelty, every comment designed to make me feel less than I am. I kept my voice level, factual, trying to remove emotion from the recitation even though emotion was woven through every word. She's systematically rewritten history to take credit for things she didn't do. She's minimized my actual contributions while exaggerating her own role in our family. She's used my rank and achievements as social currency to elevate herself while simultaneously resenting me for having those achievements, as if my success somehow reflects badly on her. Dad's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I've tolerated it for 6 years because I didn't want to put you in the middle. I didn't want to force you to choose between your daughter and your wife. But what happened at the gala made me understand something important. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug, needing something to anchor myself. By staying quiet, by absorbing her disrespect, by pretending everything was fine, I've been teaching her that my boundaries don't exist, that she can treat me however she wants as long as she's somewhat careful about it, that my dignity is less important than surface-level family harmony. I should have seen it happening, maybe, but I made it easy not to see. I kept showing up, kept helping financially, kept pretending her behavior was acceptable when it clearly wasn't. I leaned forward, making sure he was really hearing this. I'm not doing that anymore. Catherine doesn't get access to me going forward. She doesn't get my time, my money, my emotional energy, my patience. She doesn't get to attend military functions as my guest. She doesn't get to introduce me as her stepdaughter while actively working to undermine me. I looked at him directly, needing him to understand this wasn't negotiable. I'm not cutting you out of my life, but I am drawing a clear, firm line with Catherine. And that line isn't up for discussion or compromise. Dad was quiet for a long time. I could see him processing, weighing loyalties, trying to find a middle path that simply didn't exist in the situation. She's going to say you're overreacting. I know she will. She's going to blame your military career. Say the Air Force has made you cold and inflexible. I know. She's going to try to guilt me into fixing this, into talking you out of these boundaries. I know. I leaned forward slightly, needing him to understand the next part completely. But this isn't something you can fix, Dad. This is between me and Catherine, and the only person who can repair it is her, by genuinely acknowledging what she's done and demonstrating actual changed behavior over time. Not with excuses or justifications or explanations about stress, with real accountability and sustained different choices. He nodded slowly, his expression clearing slightly as he accepted what I was saying. I don't think she knows how to do that. I don't think taking real responsibility is something she's capable of. Then we have a fundamental problem that can't be solved. We sat in silence while our coffee grew cold. The diner's background noise, other conversations, dishes clattering, the hiss of the grill, filled the space between us in a way that felt almost comfortable despite the difficult topic. I'm sorry, Rebecca, for all of it, for not seeing what was happening clearly enough, for letting her treat you disrespectfully in my home at family events, in ways both large and small. I know you are. What do you need from me going forward? I need you to stop trying to smooth this over or find middle ground. I need you to let her experience the actual consequences of her actions instead of protecting her from them. I paused, making sure this next part was crystal clear. And I need you to know that regardless of what happens between me and Catherine, you and I are solid. That relationship doesn't change. This isn't about choosing between us, it's about me finally choosing myself. Relief washed visibly across his face, so obvious it made my chest ache. He'd been genuinely afraid of losing me. I could see that now. That fear had kept him quiet, had made him tolerate Catherine's behavior rather than risk the conflict that might drive me away permanently. But he'd had the equation backward. The real risk wasn't in confronting Catherine. The risk was in letting her continue unchecked until the damage became truly irreparable. 2 days later, Catherine called my cell phone. I saw her name on the screen and chose not to answer. She left a voicemail, her tone carefully modulated to hit notes of confusion and hurt that probably sounded genuine to anyone who didn't know her patterns. Sweetheart, I don't understand why you're so upset. I made a simple mistake at the gala. Can we please talk about this like adults? I miss you. The framing was perfect, textbook emotional manipulation. I was the one being unreasonable and childish. She was the mature one trying to reach out and mend fences. The "I miss you" was particularly calculated, designed to trigger guilt. I deleted the message without responding. She tried again a few days later, this time via text message. A long paragraph about stress she'd been under, about misunderstandings that happen in all families, about how much she valued our relationship and wanted to preserve it. Not one word acknowledging what she'd actually done. Not one phrase taking responsibility for her behavior. Not one genuine apology. I didn't respond to the text either. Within a week, Catherine's friends started reaching out. Women I barely knew, sending me messages about how Catherine was really struggling and couldn't understand what had gone wrong. They positioned themselves as neutral mediators, as caring people who could help bridge the gap if I'd just be willing to meet Catherine halfway. The halfway framing was revealing. It implied that Catherine had come partway already, that reconciliation just required me to cover the remaining distance. It erased the reality that Catherine hadn't moved at all, hadn't acknowledged wrongdoing, hadn't taken any actual steps toward accountability. I told each of them the same thing. This was between me and Catherine, and I wasn't interested in discussing it with third parties who didn't have full information about what had happened. One of Catherine's friends, a woman named Diane, who I'd met exactly twice, pushed back harder than the others. She sent a long message about how families work through difficulties, how holding grudges was toxic, how I was being harsh and unforgiving towards someone who clearly cared about me. I blocked her number without responding. Meanwhile, Catherine's version of events began circulating through her social network like a carefully crafted PR campaign. According to her story, she'd been publicly humiliated at a military event by her stepdaughter, who'd allowed some random veteran to physically grab her over a simple misunderstanding about a piece of jewelry. She was the victim of military arrogance, of a daughter who'd let career success go to her head, of a young woman who'd forgotten the importance of family in pursuit of professional achievement. I heard about this narrative third hand, through the same cousin who'd previously mentioned Catherine's comments about my absence from family events. She called me, angry on my behalf, wanting to know if I wanted her to correct the record with people. No. Let Catherine tell whatever story she needs to tell. The people who actually matter, the people who know me, they understand what really happened. But she's making you look bad to people who don't know you, people who might believe her version. I can live with that. I'd rather have some strangers think poorly of me than waste energy trying to manage Catherine's narrative. The truth was simpler than Catherine wanted to admit or could probably even recognize. She'd grabbed something valuable off my clothing in a public space, accused me of theft, and been corrected by a stranger who recognized what she didn't. Everything that followed, my boundaries, my distance, my refusal to engage, was consequence, not punishment. But acknowledging that would require Catherine to accept responsibility for her choices. And based on every message, every attempted conversation, every story she told her social circle, that wasn't something she was capable of doing. So my boundary stayed in place, firm, clear, completely non-negotiable. 3 months passed. The intensity of Catherine's outreach gradually diminished and then stopped entirely. The messages from her friends tapered off as they presumably realized I wasn't going to budge. Dad mentioned her occasionally in our regular phone calls, updates delivered in careful, neutral tones that didn't pressure me. She was still staying with Linda. She was looking for her own apartment. She was talking about possibly moving to a different city entirely, starting fresh somewhere people didn't know about the Gala incident. "How are you doing with all of this?" I asked him during one of our calls. "Tired, mostly, but better than I was before, if that makes sense." "It does." "The house is quieter now. And I don't mean just the lack of noise, I mean the lack of tension. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending managing her moods, walking on eggshells, trying to keep everything smooth." He paused, and I could hear him thinking through how to express something difficult. "I didn't realize how much I'd given up over the past 6 years. Small things mostly, my veterans group meetings, coffee with old friends from the shop, hobbies I'd let slip. Catherine always had some reason why those things weren't important, or why my time would be better spent on something she wanted done. I'm sorry you went through that." "Don't be sorry. I made choices. I'm just saying I understand better now why you pulled back, why visiting became harder for you, the atmosphere I let develop in my own house." For my part, life had simplified in unexpected ways. Without the constant expectation of regular visits, without the emotional preparation required to navigate Catherine's moods and criticisms, I discovered I had mental and emotional bandwidth I'd forgotten existed. I slept better, woke up without that low-grade anxiety about when the next family obligation or crisis would arise. I worked more efficiently, able to focus completely on my responsibilities without part of my mind always tracking family drama. I spent time with friends from base without the nagging guilt that I should be visiting Dad instead, without having to explain or justify my choices. The irony wasn't lost on me. Removing Catherine from my life had actually strengthened my relationship with Dad. We talked more frequently now, conversations less fraught because they weren't happening under Catherine's watchful management or implicit judgment. He asked better questions about my work, listened more carefully to my answers, seemed genuinely curious about the life I'd built, rather than viewing it through Catherine's lens of career-obsessed absence. I made the promotion list for Brigadier General in early fall of 2017. The notification came through official channels first, a formal letter I had to sign for, then a call from my commanding officer with congratulations, then a flood of messages from colleagues who'd heard through the military grapevine before I'd fully processed it myself. I called Dad immediately. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been near his phone, probably hoping to hear from me. "One-star, Dad, I made Brigadier General." The silence on his end lasted just long enough to make me wonder if we'd been disconnected. Then I heard him take a shaky breath. "Your mother would be so incredibly proud right now, so proud she'd probably cry." "I know. I'm proud too. I hope you know that. I hope you've always known that." "I do know I've always known." He asked about the timeline for the promotion ceremony, what the new assignment would entail, whether this would affect where I'd be stationed. Normal practical questions, the kind that showed he was paying attention and understood what this meant beyond just the rank itself. "Catherine's going to hear about it eventually," he said after a pause. "Probably already has through some channel or another." "Probably." "She might want to reach out. Try to take credit somehow, or maybe just insert herself back into your life now that there's something worth claiming. She can want whatever she wants. It doesn't obligate me to respond or engage." Another pause, longer this time. "I like this version of you, Rebecca. Calmer, more centered somehow." He was right. I was calmer, the constant low-level anxiety about managing Catherine's reactions, about keeping family peace, about being enough, all of that had lifted when I'd finally stopped trying to meet impossible standards. The official pinning ceremony was small and dignified, held at the command center with a handful of senior officers and my immediate team. Dad made the 6-hour drive up without complaint, stood in the front row wearing the same suit from the gala, watching as the Brigadier General stars were pinned to my shoulders. Catherine didn't attend. I hadn't invited her, and Dad hadn't asked if he should mention it to her. After the ceremony, we went to dinner at a quiet Italian restaurant off base. Just the two of us, like it used to be before Catherine entered our lives. We talked about work, about his veterans group that he'd rejoined, about a woodworking project he was building in his garage. Normal conversation, easy, comfortable, unforced. "Have you heard from her recently?" I asked. Not because I wanted to reopen any doors, but because I was curious where things actually stood. "She called about 3 weeks ago. Asked if I'd talk to you about possible reconciliation." "What did you tell her?" "That it wasn't my place to run interference. That if she wanted to fix things with you, she needed to approach you directly. And that she needed to actually apologize, really apologize, not just explain or justify." "How did she take that?" He smiled slightly, without much humor. "Not well. She said I was choosing you over her, forcing her out of the family." "You told her that's not how any of this works." "I did. Told her I'm not choosing anyone. I'm just refusing to run interference or make excuses for behavior that was clearly wrong. Told her I'm done protecting her from the consequences of her own choices." He looked at me across the table, his expression clear and direct. "She really didn't like hearing that?" "I imagine not." We finished dinner without drama or heavy emotional conversations. Just a hug in the parking lot, a promise to call soon, a comfortable understanding that we'd found our footing again as father and daughter. I drove back to base thinking about leadership, about the difference between authority and control, about how real strength shows up in the ability to maintain boundaries without cruelty or vindictiveness. Catherine had confused control with connection. She'd believed that managing everyone's behavior, controlling information flow, positioning herself at the center of every story, she'd believed those things created family bonds. But family isn't built on control. It's built on trust, honesty, mutual respect, and the willingness to admit when you're wrong. Catherine had never learned those lessons. Perhaps she'd never been taught them, or perhaps she'd learned different lessons that served her in other ways. Either way, it wasn't my responsibility to teach her now, or to sacrifice my own well-being trying. Winter transitioned to spring in 2018, bringing with it a sense of renewal that felt appropriate. My new assignment as Brigadier General came with responsibilities that challenged me in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Strategic planning at the highest levels, coordination across multiple branches and agencies, decisions that affected thousands of personnel and millions in resources. The work was demanding, often exhausting, but it felt exactly right. I'd earned this position through decades of consistent competence and leadership, through the kind of sustained excellence that only comes from genuine commitment rather than mere ambition. Dad started visiting me more frequently, making the drive up to base to see where I worked, to meet the people I supervised, to understand the full scope of what my job actually entailed. Catherine had never shown real interest in those details. She'd wanted the status that came with having a general as a stepdaughter, but not the substance of understanding what that actually meant. Dad was different. He asked thoughtful questions, listened carefully to my answers, took genuine pride in the work I was doing without trying to claim any credit for it or make it about himself in any way. One weekend in April, we attended a smaller military event together, a recognition ceremony for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. I wore my dress uniform with its full complement of ribbons and decorations, the visual record of my service feeling both weighty and earned. We were standing near the refreshment table when an older veteran approached us. Not the same man who'd intervened at the gala, but someone similar. Army background, probably late 60s, moving with the careful deliberation of someone managing old injuries that would never fully heal. He looked at my uniform, at the single star on each shoulder, and smiled with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Brigadier General, that's a significant achievement. Thank you for your continued service." He noticed the pin I wore on my civilian jacket draped over one arm. I'd worn both, changing between the formal ceremony and the reception. His expression shifted, recognition flickering across weathered features. "May I look closer?" I nodded. He leaned in without touching, studying the small bronze piece, then straightened with something like reverence in his expression. "Your great-uncle?" Yes, First Lieutenant James Sullivan, Normandy, 1944. He'd be proud to see this. That it's still being honored by family, being worn by someone who understands its true meaning. Something tight in my chest loosened slightly. Not broke, but eased. The anger and hurt I'd been carrying since the gala, since Catherine had tried to rip this piece of my history away, finally began to release its grip. Thank you for saying that. He nodded once in that way veterans have, a gesture that conveys understanding beyond words, then moved on to rejoin his own group. Dad was quiet beside me. When I glanced at him, I saw his eyes were wet with unshed tears. You okay? Yeah, just thinking about your mom, about how much she would have loved to see you here, wearing that pin, carrying on the family legacy of service. I think about that too, more than I probably admit. We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the crowd, veterans and active duty personnel mixing with families and supporters, all gathered to honor service and sacrifice. It was a good event, the kind that reminded you why the difficult work mattered. I'd started noticing small joys again over the months since establishing boundaries with Catherine. Things I'd lost track of while my energy was constantly drained by managing her moods and manipulations. Weekend morning runs without underlying guilt. Actually finishing books instead of reading the same page repeatedly because my mind was elsewhere. Replaying difficult conversations or anticipating the next crisis. Cooking elaborate meals that required focus and presence, rather than just eating whatever was quick. Calling friends without that nagging voice saying I should be spending the time differently, that I was being selfish by enjoying myself. My apartment felt genuinely peaceful now. Not empty or lonely, peaceful. The absence of constant tension had created space for a kind of contentment I hadn't experienced in years. Dad noticed the change in me. He mentioned it during one of our regular evening phone calls. You sound different lately. Different how? Lighter, somehow. More like yourself. More like you used to sound before Catherine came into the picture. He was absolutely right. I was happier. Not because Catherine was absent from my life, but because I'd stopped apologizing for protecting my own boundaries and well-being. I'd stopped believing that enduring disrespect was somehow the price of maintaining family connections. I'd finally learned that family isn't just about who you're related to by blood or law. It's about who shows up with honesty and respect, who earns their place through consistent positive behavior, rather than demanding it through guilt or obligation. Catherine had confused access with relationship. She'd believed that marrying my father automatically entitled her to my time, resources, and tolerance of whatever behavior she chose to display. But entitlement isn't love, control isn't connection, and obligation without respect isn't family. It's just dysfunction with a familiar name. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected message through LinkedIn from the veteran who'd intervened at the gala. Someone had connected us through mutual military contacts, and he'd reached out with a simple note. His name was retired Colonel James Fletcher. He'd served 32 years in the Army, including multiple combat deployments and years in various leadership roles, the kind of career that leaves permanent marks, both visible and invisible. I hope my intervention at that event didn't cause you additional discomfort. I simply couldn't stand by and watch someone disrespect what your family sacrificed. I wrote back immediately, thanking him for his actions and explaining what the pin meant to me, how it connected me to family history I'd never fully known but tried to honor through my own service. We exchanged several more messages over the following weeks. He shared stories about men he'd served with, about what real leadership looks like in impossible situations, about how you recognize when someone has genuinely earned their authority versus when they're simply wearing the rank. Real leaders don't need to announce themselves or control everyone around them, he wrote in one message. They just show up consistently, do the work with integrity, and earn trust through their actions over time. It was wisdom that only comes from decades of direct experience, from witnessing both successful and failed leadership in high-stakes environments where the consequences of bad leadership can be measured in lives lost. I thought about Catherine, about her desperate need to control narratives and manage perceptions, about how threatened she'd been by any suggestion that she wasn't essential or central. I thought about the difference between genuine confidence and deep insecurity masked as control. The final message I sent to Colonel Fletcher said simply, "Thank you for seeing what needed to be seen that night, and for acting when it mattered most." His response came within the hour. "That's what we do in the military community. We look out for each other." especially when civilians don't understand what they're dealing with. Spring turned to early summer. Work continued its demanding pace. Briefings that required synthesizing massive amounts of information, training exercises coordinating multiple units, personnel decisions requiring careful judgment about people's capabilities and potential. I'd fully settled into the rhythm and responsibilities of my new rank, understanding both its expanded opportunities and its increased weight. Dad and I maintained our steady contact pattern, weekly phone calls that sometimes lasted 10 minutes, sometimes an hour depending on what was happening, monthly visits when our schedules aligned, the occasional text about nothing particularly important, just staying connected. The relationship had found a healthy equilibrium, no longer filtered through Catherine's presence or shaped by her reactions and demands. I heard about Catherine occasionally through Dad's remaining social connections to her circle. She'd moved to a different city 2 states away, taken a management position at a boutique hotel, seemed to be establishing a new life where people didn't know about the Gala incident or our family history. I felt nothing particular about these updates. Not satisfaction, not concern, just neutral acknowledgement that she was living her life somewhere else. One evening in June, Dad called with an unusual request. There's a community event here next month honoring local veterans and their families. They've asked if I'd be willing to speak briefly about your mom's family history, about the Medal of Honor, and what it represents. What did you tell them? That I'd need to check with you first. It's your story as much as mine, and that pin belongs to you now. I thought about it for a moment, about the pin and what it represented, about the years of carrying it without fully understanding its weight, without knowing the complete story of sacrifice it memorialized. Tell them yes, I'll come too if the date works with my schedule. You don't have to make the trip. I know you're busy. I want to be there for this. The event was held at the local community center on a warm Saturday in mid-July. Perhaps 200 people attended. Veterans from multiple generations and service branches, their families, local officials, community members who cared about preserving military history and honoring service. Dad spoke for about 10 minutes in his straightforward, unpretentious way. He talked about my mother, about her great-uncle First Lieutenant James Sullivan, who'd earned the Medal of Honor at Normandy, about the specific sacrifice that achievement represented. He talked about family legacies and the responsibility of carrying forward the memory of people who gave absolutely everything so others could live. He didn't mention Catherine, didn't reference the Gala or any of the painful history that had brought us to this moment. He simply told the story truthfully and respectfully, letting it speak for itself. When he finished, the audience applauded, not because the story was particularly dramatic in the telling, but because it was real and connected them to something larger than individual experience. Afterward, several veterans approached wanting to see the pin up close, to hear additional details, to share their own family stories of service and loss. One elderly woman, probably in her mid-70s, told me her father had served in the same division as my great-uncle. She'd heard stories about that particular battle, about the impossible odds, about the men who never made it home. Your family has earned the right to be proud. Make sure you pass these stories forward to the next generation. I will. I stood in that community center, surrounded by people who genuinely understood the cost of military service, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. Not dramatically or suddenly, but like a key finally turning in a lock that had been stuck for years. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of clarity and self-understanding. I'd successfully removed a toxic person from my life. I'd established and maintained firm boundaries even when it was uncomfortable. I'd refused to apologize for protecting my own dignity and well-being. And by doing so, I'd created space for authentic relationships to thrive. Dad and I drove to dinner after the event at the same diner where we'd had our difficult conversation months earlier. Over mediocre coffee and surprisingly good pie, we talked about nothing particularly important and everything that mattered. Thank you for coming today. Having you there meant everything. Of course, this is family history, our history together. He looked at me across the scarred Formica table. Your mom would have been incredibly proud, not just of the rank and achievements, but of how you handled everything with Catherine. You stood up for yourself without being cruel. You set boundaries without being vindictive. I learned a lot of that from you, Dad, from watching how you handled difficult situations with integrity. Maybe, but you took it further than I ever did. You were braver about it. We finished our meal and said goodnight without heavy emotion or dramatic declarations. Just a solid hug in the parking lot, a promise to talk soon, and the comfortable understanding that we'd found our way back to the relationship we'd always had before Catherine complicated everything. Years passed like water moving downstream, steady, inexorable, carrying me forward through promotions and assignments, challenges and achievements, the normal rhythm of a military career building toward its conclusion. I stood in the reception hall at Fort Myer in November 2032, wearing 3 stars on each shoulder. Lieutenant General. The promotion ceremony had concluded an hour earlier, and now came the social portion I'd always found simultaneously meaningful and exhausting. Dad was 89 now, moving much more slowly, but still mentally sharp, still fundamentally himself. He'd flown in from Arizona, where he'd been living near his sister for the past 5 years, making the trip despite the difficulty of travel at his age. We talked every week without fail, visited when possible, maintained the strong bond we'd rebuilt after Catherine's departure from our lives. I hadn't thought about Catherine in years, not consciously or with any particular emotion. She'd become simply a closed chapter, a difficult period that had taught important lessons, but no longer occupied any mental or emotional space. I'd heard through distant channels that she'd remarried, moved to Europe with her new husband, built an entirely different life far from her past. A young captain approached me during the reception, looking hesitant. "Ma'am, there's someone at the entrance asking to speak with you. She says she's family." My stomach tightened reflexively. Old muscle memory from years of managing Catherine's unpredictability, even though I'd long since moved past that dynamic. "Who is it?" "Catherine Hayes. She said she used to be your stepmother." I looked toward the entrance and saw her standing there. Older, obviously, 74 now, hair completely silver, face deeply lined in ways that suggested difficult years rather than peaceful aging. She stood clutching a small purse, looking simultaneously defiant and deeply uncertain. Dad appeared at my elbow, his hand finding my arm. "I had no idea she was coming. I didn't tell her about this." "I know you didn't." "You don't have to talk to her, Rebecca. You don't owe her anything." "I know." But curiosity pulled me forward. Not hope for reconciliation, not desire to relitigate the past, but simple human curiosity about what could bring someone back after 16 years of total silence. I crossed the room slowly. Catherine saw me coming and straightened her posture, visibly trying to summon confidence that clearly wasn't natural anymore. "Rebecca, congratulations, 3 stars. That's truly remarkable." "Thank you. What are you doing here, Catherine?" "I saw the announcement online. I wanted to see you, to tell you I'm genuinely proud of what you've achieved." She paused, seeming to gather courage, and to apologize, really apologize, not the way I tried years ago, but truly. I studied her face carefully, looking for signs of manipulation I'd learned to recognize long ago. But what I saw instead was something closer to genuine resignation, the kind that comes when someone has finally run out of road and excuses. It's been 16 years. I know. I needed every one of those years to understand what I did wrong, what I kept doing wrong even after you tried to tell me, even after that night at the gala. She glanced past me at Dad, who'd followed at a discreet distance. "I hurt both of you terribly. I made everything about me, about my image, my needs, my insecurities. And I lost the only real family I had, because I couldn't stop trying to control everything." I didn't respond immediately, letting her words settle while the reception continued around us. "I don't need you to forgive me. I'm not asking for that. I just wanted you to know I finally understand that you were completely right, that I spent years blaming you for setting boundaries when I should have been grateful you were honest enough to set them. You tried to show me who I was becoming, and I fought you every step instead of listening." Dad's hand touched my elbow gently, a question, not a directive. "I appreciate you saying that, Catherine. I do. But 16 years is a very long time. We've both built completely different lives. I know, I'm not asking to be part of yours. I gave up that right through my own behavior." She managed a small, sad smile that looked genuine. "I just wanted to see you succeed at the highest levels. To know that you made it here, not just despite my behavior, but because of who you fundamentally are. And to say I'm deeply sorry I ever tried to take any of that from you, or make you feel less than you are." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back. The pin, the one I grabbed that night. Do you still have it? Yes, I wear it for important occasions. Good. It belongs with you. It always did. I just couldn't see that then. She walked away, disappearing into the crowd and then out the door, leaving as quietly as she'd arrived. I stood there with Dad beside me, processing this unexpected encounter after so many years of complete silence. How do you feel? He asked quietly. Honestly? Okay, she said what she apparently needed to say. I heard it. But it doesn't change the fundamental reality that we're done. Some things once broken can't be repaired. That's fair. That's healthy. He squeezed my arm. Now let's go enjoy your accomplishment. You earned every bit of it through your own merit and hard work. We rejoined the reception. I didn't look back toward the door. Over the following weeks, I reflected on Catherine's appearance without obsessing over it. She'd apologized genuinely as far as I could tell, acknowledged her behavior without deflection, recognized the damage she'd caused, and I'd accepted the apology without accepting her back into my life. Because forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing. You can acknowledge someone's growth, appreciate their honesty, even wish them well in their life elsewhere, without inviting them back into your personal space. Some relationships, once broken badly enough, simply can't be repaired. Not because either person is necessarily unwilling, but because too much damage occurred, too much time passed, too much fundamental trust was destroyed. Catherine and I were finished 16 years ago. Her apology didn't undo that or change the calculus. It just provided closure to a chapter that had already ended. I thought about my younger self who tried so desperately to make things work with Catherine, who'd absorbed disrespect to avoid conflict, who'd believed family meant enduring whatever was thrown at you. That version of me had learned crucial lessons about boundaries, self-respect, the difference between loyalty and self-betrayal. Those lessons had shaped everything that came after: how I led, how I built relationships, how I understood my own worth. In an odd way, Catherine had taught me something genuinely valuable, though not in any way she'd intended. By pushing me past my breaking point, by forcing me to choose between my dignity and her comfort, she'd shown me what I was truly capable of. I was capable of walking away from toxicity, of maintaining boundaries even when it cost me socially, of protecting myself even when it disappointed or angered others. That was real strength, the kind that doesn't announce itself or demand recognition, the kind that simply exists steadily, built on self-knowledge and hard-won clarity. Dad and I talked about Catherine's appearance during our next phone call. She looked different, humbled in a way I never saw before. Maybe genuine humility, 16 years too late, doesn't rebuild what was destroyed. No, it doesn't, he agreed. But I'm glad she apologized for her own sake. Carrying that weight around for 16 years, that's its own form of suffering. I never wanted to punish her, Dad. I just wanted her to stop hurting me, to stop treating me like I was less than I am. I know, and that's the crucial difference. You were protecting yourself. She was trying to control you. Those aren't equivalent even when they both result in distance. He was right about that. Intention matters profoundly. Catherine had spent years attempting to control how I showed up in the world, how I was perceived, what I contributed to her social image. When I removed myself from that dynamic, I wasn't punishing her. I was protecting myself from ongoing harm. The fact that my self-protection felt like punishment to her revealed more about her expectations than about my actions. Winter settled over Washington, bringing the kind of cold that cuts through even heavy coats. I watched the first significant snowfall from my office window, coating the base in temporary white that would turn to gray slush by afternoon. I'd been in the military for 38 years now, more than half my life spent in service to something larger than individual concerns. It had cost me certain things, the kind of stable home life most people build in their 20s and 30s, relationships that couldn't survive long deployments and frequent relocations, the certainty that comes with more predictable career paths. But it had given me purpose, structure, clear understanding of my own capabilities. It had shown me what I was made of under pressure, what I could endure, what I absolutely refused to compromise. And perhaps most importantly, it had taught me that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about knowing what you'll break for and what you won't. I wouldn't break for convenience or false peace or the comfort of people who didn't respect me, but I would sacrifice and endure for truth, for justice, for people who'd earned my loyalty through their own consistent integrity. That was the line I'd learned to draw, clear and absolutely non-negotiable. The pin sat on my desk in its protective case, catching afternoon light from the window. I picked it up carefully, held it, felt the weight of history it represented. My great-uncle James Sullivan had died at 24, younger than I'd been when I made captain. He'd never had the chance to build a career, to see his sacrifice honored across generations, to know that nearly 90 years later, someone would still carry his memory forward with intention and respect. But his choice, to run toward danger so others could escape it, that choice echoed through decades. It shaped my mother's understanding of service and sacrifice. It shaped mine. And in a strange way, it had even shaped how I'd handled Catherine. Because real courage isn't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It's about the quiet daily choice to protect what truly matters, even when it costs you something, even when others don't understand, even when you have to do it completely alone. I'd made that choice, and I'd live with it not as a burden, but as a defining mark of who I'd become. If you're hearing this story and you've ever felt diminished, ever been told you were too poor or too little, or not enough to deserve basic respect, hear me clearly when I say this. You don't owe anyone access to your life simply because they want it or believe they're entitled to it. Access is earned through respect. Trust is built through consistency. Relationship is maintained through mutual care. And when someone shows you through their repeated behavior that they're fundamentally incapable of those things, when they grab for what isn't theirs, when they minimize your worth, when they rewrite history to center themselves, you have every right to walk away. Not with anger or vindictiveness, just with clarity about what you will and won't accept. The peace you're looking for starts the moment you stop apologizing for protecting yourself. And real strength is simply knowing when you're done carrying weight that was never yours to bear. I was done, and the lightness that came with that decision, that was earned too.